Good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Woodrow Wilson Then and Now series, featuring Philip Zelikow of the University of Virginia and his book, The Road Less Traveled, The Secret Battle to End the Great War, 1916 to 1917. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars aims to unite the world of ideas to the world of policy by supporting preeminent scholarship and linking that scholarship to issues of concern to officials in Washington. Congress established the center in 1968 as the official national memorial to President Wilson. Unlike the physical monuments in the nation's capital, it's a living memorial whose work and scholarship commemorates, quote, the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson. As both a distinguished scholar and a national leader, President Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and policymaker were engaged in what he called a common enterprise. Today, the center takes seriously his views on the need to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of policy, bringing them into creative contact, enriching the work of both, and enabling each to learn from the other. This series, Wilson Then and Now, is our relatively new effort to make Wilson and his period more central to that creative contact between ideas and practice in national and global affairs. In a critical and inclusive way, we seek to highlight work on Wilson and his time that offers explicit or implicit lessons for contemporary or enduring problems of public and international life. For that reason, I'm thrilled to welcome Phil Zelikow to discuss his new book, The Road Less Traveled, The Secret Battle to End the Great War, 1916-1917, really just out from Public Affairs Books. Philip D. Zelikow is the White Burkett Miller Professor of History and J. Wilson Newmer Professor of Governance at the University of Virginia, where he has also served as Dean of the Graduate School and Director of the Miller Center. His scholarly work has focused on critical episodes in American and world history. He was a trial and appellate lawyer and then a career diplomat before taking academic positions at Harvard and then Virginia. His federal service during 5 administrations has included positions in the White House, State Department, and the Pentagon. He directed a small and short-lived, but I would say very important, federal agency, the 9/11 Commission, which produced a report that remains essential to understanding, as best we can, the terrible events of September 2001. He also directed an earlier bipartisan commission on election reform, chaired by former Presidents Carter and Ford, that led to successful passage of the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Phil is one of the few individuals ever to serve on the President's intelligence advisory boards for presidents of both parties in the administrations of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. In recognition of his long and distinguished service to the United States, he was elected a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy in 2020. Phil's new book exhibits the historical perspective he has long sought to bring to the practice of diplomacy. He traces the secret efforts over more than 5 months from August 1916 to January 1917 of leaders from the United States, Britain, and Germany to end the Great War through a US-mediated peace conference. They did so far out of public sight, one reason why their effort, which came astonishingly close to ending the war and saving millions of lives, is little understood today. In The Road Less Traveled, Phil brings this story into the light, complicating our understanding of the war and the nature of the peace that did eventually follow. As befits this series, he places particular emphasis on President Woodrow Wilson's role in creating the opportunity for peace, as well as his failure to ensure its realization. I'm going to ask Phil to give a few brief remarks, giving an overview of his argument. Then I will ask him some questions, most admiring, a few perhaps challenging, that I hope will further illuminate the importance of his book to historians, diplomats, and anyone seeking a better understanding of the world the Great War made, and which in many ways is the world still with us today. Then I will turn to the chat box to see if I can construct some questions out of the audience queries and comments. So I invite you to put your comments and questions there. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Philip Zelikow.
Oh, thanks, Trig, very much for that nice introduction. So this is a book about why the First World War did not end at the halfway point. Why didn't the war end halfway before the United States became involved? before the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia, before many millions of lives were lost, before Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the whole Middle East plunged off the precipice into years of civil and international war that helped wreck the peace. Why didn't the war end at the halfway point? So in a way, I start with an interesting thesis. Every American schoolboy who studies World War I, if they are asked on their exam, why did America enter World War I? Will answer that question with something to do with German U-boats. The reason America entered the war, they are taught, everyone was taught, I was taught, is that the Germans declared the U-boat war, the unrestricted submarine warfare, defying an agreement they had earlier made to restrain their U-boat warfare the previous year. So, standard story, America enters World War I because of the German U-boat war. The argument in this book is that the reason America entered World War I is because the peace talks to end the war seemed to have failed. The only reason the Germans declared the U-boat war, the wider war, is because the German military and the Kaiser concluded that their 5 months of effort to end the war with peace talks had failed, and the U-boat war was the only alternative left. So the declaration of the U-boat war came because the peace talks failed. The reason America entered the war was because the peace talks failed. Therefore, this is a story of why did the peace talks fail. Now, some of you, there are more than 130 people on the webinar, at least. So all of you now can ask yourself, how many of you knew that there were even peace talks going on in 1916-17? To be specific, how many of you knew that in August 1916, in the summer of 1916, the German government asked the United States to mediate an end to the war, asked them unconditionally and quite secretly? So first, the question really is, how many of you knew that the German government, this was not an informal set of peace feelers done through intermediaries. This is straight up. This is the chancellor writing to, through the German embassy in Washington with the approval of the Kaiser. This is a formal diplomatic approach, actually, which was reiterated by the Kaiser personally in a letter to Wilson a couple of months later. So, question, how many of you knew that the Germans had formally sought American mediation to end the war in the summer of 1916? And then for those 3 of you who knew about that, you can then ask yourself, hey, and by the way, do you know what happened to that German peace move? What happened to the German peace move? And I'll be surprised if anyone knows the answer to that. So that's the first question. Second question, did you know, those of you who've studied World War I, did you know that the British government at the same time, the British government now, quite seriously considered seeking a negotiated peace through Woodrow Wilson in the autumn of 1916? That the British government at the highest levels, I mean now a discussion of the full British cabinet, discussed the issue of whether or not they should end the war with a negotiated peace in the autumn of 1916 that would be arranged through the offices of Woodrow Wilson. If you did not know how seriously the British, and by the way, the French, considered making peace, did not know about the German offer to have Wilson negotiate the peace, and did not know that this had been going on for months, then you don't know, in a way, one of the great stories of world history at a turning point. The turning point before American entry, before the war widens, before the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik takeover as the war continued, before the millions of lives lost and all the rest. This book is that story. And in fact, it turns out, not only was this the story of these peace talks, but the peace talks came amazingly close to succeeding because the positions of the two sides were not irreconcilable. In fact, the The compromise peace the Germans were prepared to offer had terms in it that were perfectly calculated to appeal to the key factions who wanted peace in the British government and probably the French government as well. And in any case, the British and French would have had no choice but to make peace because they were about to go bankrupt in the dollars they needed to continue the war. Another one of the war's great secrets, by the way. So in a way, this book is about how the war was on the verge of ending, if nothing else for financial reasons, in 1916-17, but it did not. And why it did not is one of the most amazing historical stories I've ever come across in my entire career. And I think this is the first book that fully brings that story together, drawing on materials in the American, German, British archives, among other international sources, in one place, so it finally sees the light of day. It's an amazing story, and the people are amazing. And in a way, it's a hopeful story, though the outcome is tragic. Hopeful in this: we have this image of World War I, of sort of the valiant soldiers stalemated in the trenches, being led by narrow-minded donkeys, the heroes led by donkeys. In fact, at the midpoint of the war, in the summer and fall of 1916, after the disaster at Verdun, after the disaster of the Somme, the leaders did try to find a way out. That's the amazingly hopeful story. They were not entirely blind. They tried hard to find a way out. Most of the leaders were prepared to compromise on terms that could have worked, that would have been much like the borders of Europe before World War I. And this is the story of why they came so agonizingly close, and also of why they didn't make it. It's a story about how statecraft could have worked and how statecraft in this case did not work.
For the first time in a long time, I remembered to unmute myself before speaking. Thank you very much, Phil, for that overview. Before I get into what I will signal will be some of the friendly disagreements that Phil and I may have, I want to just compliment the author on a truly fantastic book. I learned an incredible amount about a period that I've studied fairly closely. I also have to compliment the narrative. And actually, I want to ask you first about your organizational methods. The narrative, it's a very powerful narrative. It's almost like a kind of a drill. It is spiraling back and forth between all of these conversations in different countries and different foreign offices. And yet it moves sort of relentlessly forward, not in a deterministic way, but in a way that keeps the argument ever at the forefront. At the same time, there's a wonderful appreciation for the contingency of historical events. Bettman's, it turns out, ill-advised decision to push out someone he thought was a militarist, Falkenhayn, and instead recruit Hindenburg and Ludendorff into the Kaiser's high command, which turns out to have been a misstep. Or Lloyd George's decision to put his political career ahead of the prospects of peace by announcing publicly that with no authorization from the prime minister or the foreign secretary, he was, I think, war secretary at the time, that Britain will fight to the finish for a knockout blow. So there are just all of these wonderful moments of contingency. And the narrative is really one that gives this dual effect of something very grand going on, but really kind of excruciatingly human at the same time. So people who like to read good history will love this book for that reason. And I'm curious how you organized your narrative. How did you decide, in what order to address the various discussions?
It's a great question, and I think you, in a way, have to almost organize it as if you're lining up the storyboards for in a movie production, because you actually want to hold the narrative in view, and then you have to be sure you don't move back and forth in time so radically that you unmoor the reader or that you lose focus on the central story. That's not unrealistic, because actually they're focusing on the common story. One of the amazing things in the story, as you know, is that the Germans are doing all this with Wilson in secret, but that the British, at the time they're having their peace debates in autumn 1916, the British, the tiny center of the British cabinet, the War Committee, know about the German move. They have intercepted German telegrams and decoded them that have told them that the Germans have made this move with Wilson. So they know about the German effort to get Wilson to negotiate peace. And that's part of what is coloring their debates in the autumn of 1916 as they come so close to saying yes, because of their own desperate position. So yes, you have to then kind of, and then what I try to do also is bring in the perspectives of ordinary people in important ways, like the way I begin the book with the Robert Frost poem and its origins. The famous poem, The Road Not Taken, many people don't realize the whole context of that poem arose out of the friendship of Robert Frost with an English poet named Edward Thomas, debating in a way the issue of war or peace between the two men, close friends, in 1915. That was the context in which Frost wrote that famous poem. Thomas himself was facing the kind of choice everyone was facing in the middle of the war. And then Thomas made his choice between the two roads. The context for that poem is really a moving backdrop here that I wanted to put in at the beginning and then at the end. And in the middle, I take the reader away from the cabinet room, so to speak, and I take them to the uncertainty on the front line itself through the eyes of the British Prime Minister's eldest son. The Prime Minister was Herbert Asquith. And I take the reader into the world of Asquith's eldest son, himself, one of the brilliant idols of his generation, a man named Raymond Asquith, as he is actually fighting on the front lines and experiencing personally, in a way, all the uncertainty that the politicians in London are trying to make sense of. But through his eyes, you also see the human reality and the stakes in those debates going on in the cabinet rooms around the green table, so to speak.
Another thing I learned from this book, a couple things. I, having studied Wilson for many years, was always a little bit confused by the degree to which he relied on Colonel Edward House as an advisor. But even I was taken aback at just the sheer level of not just dissembling, but at sometimes insubordination on the part of House and also Robert Lansing at various times. On the other hand, I really learned a lot about Chancellor Bettmann Hollweg and his real dogged efforts to try to salvage millions of lives during the period that you discuss. So anyone who's just interested in historical characters and characteristics will find, I think, especially those two stories interesting. I wanted to ask you, though, you spent obviously lots of time in the British Foreign Archives and were able to somehow not only navigate them, but find things that even I would say 20 or 25 years ago may not have even been accessible. I don't know the exact timing of when those things ultimately became fully declassified. But one of the surprising things, while there's this, obviously the British and Germans are so central to this, is the relatively minor role of the French. And I'm wondering if you can talk about why you think the French government played such a relatively minor role in this peace window.
Yeah, one of the greatest secrets actually was that the French actually wanted to get out of the war too, but the French leaders could not say so publicly. So one of the documentary finds. Oh, and by the way, let me pay a little credit to a colleague. A couple of colleagues. There are a couple of other historians who are also uncovering some of the pieces of this same story and are publishing it. One of them, whom I think has done a terrific job, is a younger scholar named Daniel Larson at Cambridge, who has a book called Plotting for Peace coming out from Cambridge University Press later this year. And Larson has also uncovered some astonishing evidence, especially on the British side, and deserves some notice. And his story is quite complementary to the one that I tell. Also on the German side, Holger Offlerbach's new book, which is not available in English, but I'm told is being translated into English, Auf Messerschneide, is a terrific account of the latter part of the war from the German point of view. And again, his work in the German evidence complements and reinforces some of the arguments that I was making. But back to your question on the French. In August 1916, literally in the same week that the German chancellor is reaching out to the Americans to ask them to mediate peace, there is an astonishing meeting between the president of France, Raymond Poincaré, and the British King, George V. Those of you who know French history know that Poincaré is no pacifist. Poincaré was a conservative nationalist. He was a key figure in the events of July 1914 that led to the war. He was the author in the French public eye of the Union Sacrée, the sacred union to unite all the political factions in France to wage the war. So think about this. This is Poincaré, the great war hawk. Poincaré met privately with the British king, August 1916, and confided to him one-on-one, no one else in the room. France must make peace. We must end the war as soon as possible. I expect that the opportunity for peace will come later this year through Woodrow Wilson, through a Wilson mediation. When it comes, we must take it. He's confiding this to the king so the king will know and let people know back in Britain. We must take it. The French people don't understand how bad the situation is. They are not aware of the fact that Russia is tottering and may soon fall. The only reason I know about this, by the way, this conversation I've just described is not in any of the standard Poincaré biographies, because Poincaré kept this position completely secret. Now, he had his prime minister, Aristide Briand, actually begin some very secret peace feelers with a German emissary from Bethmann occurring inside Switzerland during the winter of 1617. But meanwhile, the only reason I know about Poincaré's confidences to the king about this, which were, by the way, passed back to London, is because the way the king passed them back is he called in the British ambassador to Paris, a man named Francis Bertie, and he debriefed Bertie. He said, you're the ambassador to Paris. Let me tell you what Poincaré told me. Bertie recorded all of this in his diaries. Then when Bertie published his diary in the 1920s, he omitted all of this. But Bertie's original diaries, the handwritten diaries, are still actually in the British archives, which I cite. And he has all of this. And then Bertie had to reveal all of this to the War Committee of the British Cabinet later that month, before Asquith met with Briand, who would know all about it. So the British government at the end of August 1916 knew in the most secret possible way that actually the French were looking for a way out of the war, which comes back to your question. The French don't play as important a role because by this time, the French are financially and militarily dependent on the British to continue the war. So the British, in effect, are kind of the controlling dial on whether or not to sustain the war. They're also looking to the British in part to offer them the face-saving way out of the war, since the French themselves cannot publicly ask to quit without fatally compromising their whole position in the fight. So that's in a way, there is a secret desire on the French to find a way out, but they can't admit it publicly, so it's not publicly known. And they have to defer a lot to the British to take the diplomatic lead in helping to find this way out.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now is, I think, the fun part. We're going to maybe do a little bit of academic battle, and then we'll come back and try to find a negotiated settlement. So I have, in the spirit of this seminar, I do have a few interpretive challenges that I want to pose to you, and fittingly, they all revolve around Wilson's role. Wilson is central in your account, and I will telegraph that I find many of the judgments of Wilson's performance to be much more measured than you find in many accounts. But I have some questions and some challenges that I'd like to lay. So I'm going to just kind of go through May 1916, then maybe fall 16 to winter 17, and then that final critical end of January and early February 1917, where everything falls apart.
Your audience should be able to see Woodrow Wilson right now.
He can, yes, there he is, Woodrow Wilson. So in May of 1916, I read his speech to the League to Enforce Peace very differently than you did. It seems to me that it was the British, not Wilson, who was to blame for that very early failure of the peace project. I don't think the speech articulated disdain for the objects and concerns of the war. I think he was trying to articulate impartiality. He was not at that point going to judge who was at fault. Instead, he wanted to focus on freedom of the seas to court the German and US audiences, and on banding together against selfish aggression and to protect, quote, the inviolable rights of peoples, obviously courting Allied and US audiences who saw Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium as the war's defining moment. And meanwhile, Wilson had signaled the very same attitude in a letter that reached the British cabinet a week before his speech, and they were still hotly debating peace at that point. Then, of course, J.P. Morgan, and this is another wonderful part of your story, J.P. Morgan arranges to relieve Britain's financial woes for a few more months, and suddenly the peace option is shelved by the British cabinet. And as late as August 28th, British Foreign Secretary Grey is still telling House that any peace move would be premature, seen as pro-German. Of course, Lloyd George then publicly commits the British government to a fight to the finish by a knockout blow. Seems to me that made it impossible for the British government from then on to entertain anything but a peace that made Germany look like a supplicant. So that's my first moment that I'd like you to respond to. The second is in the fall of 1916 and the winter 1916-17.
We may want to take these one at a time.
Can we take them one at a time? Sure.
For the audience to hold these.
Sure. Yeah, no, let's go ahead.
Together.
Go ahead, respond, please.
So what Trygve is referring to, and the narrative is intricate, necessarily so. He's referring actually to the first real window for peace was actually back in in the spring of 1916. At that time, Wilson was pleading with the British to ask for his mediation. The British decide not to ask for his mediation. Actually, their cabinet considered it on 3 different occasions, of which they came closest on the third one, which is the one that Trygve is talking about in late May. He points out, I think, and you can make the argument, it's really mainly the British fault that they didn't ask for his mediation, not Wilson's. It was a very close call, and it turns on this. There was the peace camp in the British cabinet had the majority of the cabinet, but the center of that group, which was led by Arthur Balfour, needed Germany to at least make some concessions towards it needed to be a compromise peace. It wouldn't just be Britain is willing to quit with the battle lines where they were, with Germany owning Belgium. So what Balfour had drafted a message that he was going to ask the cabinet to approve that said, we will accept your mediation, but you need to assure us you're going to work for us on these to make sure this is a compromise peace. That key meeting was going to be held on May 29th. The British told Wilson and House that they were going to have their key meeting on May 29th. Wilson gives a speech hoping that this will bring the British along by offering them the American commitment to the post-war League that he believes, with cause, is something the British care about. I blamed Wilson a little bit for having screwed up the diplomacy because they had not, he gives a speech in which he seems to stand away from offering any pressure on territorial concessions. In other words, he distances America from seeking to pressure the Germans to make a compromise peace. Yet it is just that pressure that the peace faction needs to hear so they can sell the peace deal to the British government. And that standoffishness is what hurt. Trygve can interpret Wilson's expression as merely a statement of disinterest, not a statement of disdain, and that's a fair reading. The British read it as disdain. But here's the more important thing. All he needed to do is secretly reassure the British that, yes, indeed, we will be pushing for these compromise provisions. And realizing this at the last minute, House sent the British that reassurance that they needed, but he sent it by a letter sent on May 27th. The key British meeting was on May 29th. By the time the letter had arrived, the British, indignant at Wilson's speech, which they thought had walked back his commitment to help them get a compromise, had thrown this aside and committed them, well, we're just going to go ahead with the summer offensive and roll the dice and see if we can improve our position on the battlefield. So what I describe it in the book is thoughtful speech, thoughtless diplomacy. Because I don't really blame Wilson for this problem here. I actually blame House. Because Wilson had pleaded with House to please help him make the case in the best possible terms for the British peace faction. And House, who was supposed to be his expert on London, did not help him do that. And therefore, that moment in which the British could have sought the mediation and closed the deal on that, which came extremely close in May 1916, that moment was lost, which then leads us to the really huge lost opportunity, which ensues in August, because now in August, it's not the British who are asking for the compromise peace. The Germans are asking for it secretly, but the British secretly know about it. And their need to get out of the war is still very great. Grey is holding House off at the end of August, but that's partly because he's still worried about the need to get some sort of compromise. And the discussions of this develop 2 days after Grey sends that message to House, August 28th, saying, hold off for now. Asquith holds a meeting of the War Committee opening the meeting saying, it's time for everyone in the cabinet to start giving me their peace terms. That's on August 30th. That, by the way, is right after he had his discussion with the French leadership and also got debriefed on Poincaré's interest in bringing the war to an end. And really from August 30th, from then on, most of the British cabinet is moving towards a negotiated peace because the war news is just terrible and the financial news is terrible. And that's the context in which Lloyd George makes his political play that Trygve was referring to at the end of September in order to position himself publicly as the win the war guy. For his political reasons, we think. There are some other arguments. The irony there is that at the very time Lloyd George is positioning himself publicly as Mr. Win the War, Privately, he is the leading opponent of the current military strategy. He is the person who in private, more eloquently than anyone else, is saying that Britain is on the path to lose the war. But so his private stance is utterly contradictory to his public stance. But that's the game that he plays in the autumn of 1916.
So this is good, because I feel like we've opened a peace window between the two of us. That perhaps it's really House and Lloyd George who are the villains in the story, but we'll see if I may.
Let me interrupt for just a moment on that, Trig, because this is such an important opportunity. My book blames Wilson for what I think ultimately for the most consequential diplomatic failure in the history of the United States. And I say that, and then I want to say this, is anyone who reads this book will come away actually in many ways with a quite positive portrait of Wilson.
That's exactly right, yes.
And that's, in a way, that's the tragedy in the story, is Wilson is not the cartoon idealist that so many school children are taught. Wilson comes across in this book as actually quite farsighted, really quite perceptive about the great issues of the war, deeply perceptive about the way to bring it to an end. In other words, at the level of grand strategy, Wilson comes across as one of the most perceptive statesmen of his time. And the tragedy then is that he can't translate his grand strategy into the choreography of the diplomacy to bring it about. It's the operational statecraft that fails him, in part because of his reliance on Edward House. And so that's here's Edward House, by the way, for those of you who
he's
trying to conjure up an image of the wealthy expatriate Texan who was Wilson's private advisor. This is a wonderful little pen and ink portrait that was made of him in 1919. But Trig and I actually share, and this one of the things I admire about Trig's own work, we share actually a fundamentally similar portrait of Wilson's grand strategy, of Wilson's, often you could call it quite pragmatic adjustments, responding to the situation. So it's a positive portrait of Wilson that sadly results in this unbelievably tragic outcome.
Yeah, and that is important. I don't mean to suggest that this is a takedown of Wilson. It is anything but. I'm trying to get at, so one of the arguments that you make is that Wilson lacked the ability, as you say, to do the diplomatic choreography. And I think maybe where we might disagree is you see that lack of ability as a little bit more innate to Wilson, whereas I see it in some ways imposed by circumstances. He has kind of dissembling and insubordinate top diplomats. He has a very, a British government that in the fall and winter of 1916-17 continues to insist that Germany publicly announce that they're going to evacuate Belgium before any conference is called, whereas the British government has known for months that Germany is willing to evacuate Belgium, and that Bethmann cannot undermine his own position with the German high command by doing that.
There's Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, by the way, for those of you trying to put a face to that name.
Is that his Prussian Academy dueling scar across his nose there too, or?
I don't know.
And then even in the, at the end, you make a very, very strong argument. I'll skip some of what I was going to cover and go kind of to January 1917. You make a very strong argument that Wilson's Peace Without Victory speech was not a bad speech or misguided, but that it needed to be similarly, again, there needed to be a second track of kind of nuts and bolts diplomacy. So just for the audience, it was in the Peace Without Victory speech that Wilson sort of tried to offer something to all the belligerents while also shoring up support in the American public for a US mediated peace. So he talks about no humiliation or crushing of one side or the other, which is important to all the populations of the major belligerents and the leaders. He insists on government by consent of the governed again, which he does to ease minds both about Belgium and Alsace, but also about the Polish buffer state that Germany really needs as a security against Russia. And finally, a League of Nations. He lays out a reason that we can all come to the peace table, not to recriminate against each other, but to join in a common project. Now, I completely agree that it would have been better for Wilson to have pursued a conference program at the same time, a really detailed conference program. But House had not informed him properly of Bernstorff's very clear directions for how to do that. Bernstorff is the German ambassador to Washington at this time, and the most important player other than Bethmann right now in the German Peace Party, I would say. The Allies, meanwhile, gratuitously reject Germany's peace note of December and call for a total reorganization of Europe. And so Wilson, there is a delay. That delay does undermine Bethmann, the chancellor in Germany. But I'm not sure exactly what else Wilson could have done unless all of these other characters were playing their roles a little bit better. And then my final question is, would it have mattered given the mindset of Ludendorff and Hindenburg and their direct access and influence over the Kaiser and their control of the military branch of the government? Did Bethmann still have the ability to have Germany be a kind of honest player by the early 1917, or were the Hawks really in Germany really in a much more powerful position than he was? Not blaming him or saying that he mishandled it, but just because of the kind of tragic evolution of the narrative. Because if I was Wilson and I received a note on the same day, January 31st, that Germany was resuming submarine warfare, but also willing to come to the table for peace, I would have interpreted it as Germany is willing to stop indiscriminately killing Americans if the United States is willing to help us get out of a war that most people in your country think we started. And our only show of good faith is that we're evacuating a country, Belgium, that we overran. Which is not to say that in hindsight, it would not have been much better for Wilson to have pursued the peace option still. I'm just wondering if he really had that option, or if it's more of a tragedy. And maybe I'm just not understanding how much we might agree on this. Or not.
So both questions have to do with some of the late developments in January 1917. So where Trig and I both agree is we both, I think, actually admire the fundamental rhetorical position in Wilson's Peace Without Victory speech, which he delivers to the Congress as an address on January 22nd, 1917. That is, at the high level, Wilson is basically outlining a conception of how the war should end on a compromise basis. And his conception of how the war should end is fundamentally sound. It is actually the same conception that Bethmann has, actually. And it's the same conception that the liberals in Britain also have. And there's a lot of information coming into Wilson on all of this. Wilson knows now from like 4 different sources that the Germans are willing to consider going back to basically pre-war borders, including an opening to the Mediterranean guaranteed for Russia, plus an independent Poland, freed from Russian rule. All right. The problem is that Wilson is taking this rhetorical stance of the nature of the peace, which we both admire, but he's not actually doing anything to bring it about. What he needed to do then is to try to arrange the peace conference. This is what people had been waiting for him to do in Germany for 5 months, is you've got to do something to bring about the peace conference. Bettman's been holding off the military who say, we know how to end this war. We can end this war with the submarine panacea. He's been holding them off with the Kaiser's support consistently now for 5 months. He'd seen off the top head of the German Navy, Tirpitz. He'd seen off the former head of the German Army, Falkenhayn. He'd arranged to bring in new commanders who were popular, whom, as he put it to the Kaiser, could help allow us to make a face-saving peace because the generals were popular, because they'd been heroes in the East. All of that. The Kaiser had stood by him again and again, even against the military pressure in October, in December. Finally, Wilson's, the false reports they're getting about Wilson, including from because of House's dissembling, Wilson's misfire with his December peace move, which was again failed to call for a conference. Now, the Kaiser and the generals have given up on Wilson. Bettman has not, but the Kaiser and generals have given up. And here he gives this peace without Bernstorff, his ambassador in Washington, has just arranged the whole choreography for how to start arranging the peace conference. And House, though House got Wilson's clearance on all of this, which was cabled to Bernstorff, yet House had not explained it well to Wilson. Then Wilson goes ahead with his peace without victory move with no other move towards the conference, which basically takes the whole table that Bernstorff had set, which was being negotiated with Berlin, and just turns that table upside down. Even then, now you've got the generals, the high command, convinced that, well, Wilson's hopeless. They then declare the unrestricted submarine warfare. Finally, Wilson comes back at the end and says, well, if Chancellor Bettman will only confide in me his secret peace terms, if he will just trust me with that, I will go try to see what I can do to arrange a conference. The generals, so they're already moving for the U-boat war. Bettman gets this message that Wilson just wants to hear his peace terms late on a Sunday night in midwinter. He jumps on an overnight train to the Kaiser's headquarters, drafting a message all the way, arrives, persuades the Kaiser to send a second message at the same time with the U-boat message, saying, you asked for our peace terms, here they are. I'm doing this. No other ally, no leader in the war had done this with Wilson. Here they are. He's written them in a way that gives him some room for negotiation and so on, but it makes it clear restoration of Belgium. It's clearly some kind of compromise peace with dickering over the details, and says, by the way, if you call a peace conference, we stop the U-boats. And Wilson is so furious, and abetted by House actually, at the German U-boat move, that he basically does not read seriously the parallel message from Bettman offering the peace terms. He kind of just throws that aside and breaks relations with Germany the next day and sends Bernstorff home. Then Wilson, who's stunned. See, Wilson thought at that moment, I'm only like 4 weeks away from having the peace conference. And he has this emotional reaction, which frankly, Bernstorff had feared would happen, to the submarine message. He then doesn't seriously read Bettman's parallel message that he had gotten approved after that overnight train ride. And Wilson now finds himself in the position of having sent Bernstorff home, but he doesn't want America to go into the war. He's trying to revive the peace talks, but he's burned his bridges to do it. He's sent the Germans home. He spends the next month and more trying to find some way out of the box he's cornered himself into. But he has, see, and I explained, here's how you would have restarted the negotiations. You would have just said, you would have pocketed Bettman's terms, and then you could have said, I'm arranging a peace conference, and as part of this arrangement, the Germans have agreed they will stop the submarine warfare as soon as the peace conference begins. I've won this concession. The Germans will end the U-boat war as soon as the peace conference I have arranged begins. And what's more, the Germans have promised, as a condition of talking peace, that they will withdraw from Belgium to show their good faith. At that point, the whole situation, Wilson would be hailed as using American leverage to come into the war to get the Germans to stop the U-boat war. At the same time, he brings people together with a peace conference with an astonishing show of German good faith that addresses the one issue that motivated the British and American publics as no others did, which was Belgium. Because all the remaining territorial issues are of very little interest to anyone in Britain and America. At that point, I think, this is then to Wilson's, Wilson looks like the great peacemaker. He stopped the U-boat war, he's brought about the peace conference, and he's persuaded the Germans to put Belgium on the table as a condition of talking peace. And he's done all this before the peace conference has even actually begun. And it would have been a diplomatic triumph for Wilson. I could put the same set of facts in front of any of my old professional diplomat friends. And I think 9 out of 10 of them would see exactly what I've just seen as to what to do with that. But you're right, is that Wilson didn't have professional diplomats helping him. He had Edward House. He had Robert Lansing, who was just an international lawyer, really, whom Wilson just regarded as little more than a clerk, who was secretly conspiring to try to get the Americans in the war on the side of the Allies, which is not what Wilson wanted at all. Wilson had a couple of very good younger diplomats advising him. William Hepburn Buckler in London, who was a junior diplomat but brilliant. The young Joseph Grew in Berlin. There were some good diplomats in the American service at that time, and they were sending some really interesting advice back to Washington, but it wasn't being used or heeded. So that's what's so incredibly tragic about this. You can blame the German generals for their hawkishness, their yearning for the submarine panacea, their yearning to find some way of finally beating down Bettman and showing that the military was really in charge in Germany. Yes, they deserve all the blame and obloquy that you want to heap upon them. But this problem was eminently solvable in January 1917, and Wilson had all the tools in his hand to solve it. He had, by this time, absolute financial leverage over the Allies. They knew it, and he knew it. In fact, he had already used that leverage. He had already effectively cut off the continuation of further loans to the Allies, and the money was probably within 6 weeks of running out. That's how close things were. Wilson is bewildered and stunned that his peacemaking has failed, and part of the irony and the tragedy is to the end of his life, he never knew and understood what had gone wrong.
Thank you very much. That was really very helpful. I think I should move on to just one or two other questions, because I think we could go back and forth on this.
No, and there are some good things coming in the chat.
There are very good things. I do want to ask just a couple of, one quick, well, I'll ask you two quick questions, and you can answer whichever one and see if you can weave in your answers to the other, maybe when I get to the audience here. One is, you and I both share a really deep interest in the way that Wilson was influenced at key points by people outside of his administration, particularly Herbert Croly and Walter Lippmann. And when you were speaking just now, I found myself wondering if indeed in those days, that January, February moment, Wilson could have done what you'd expected him, or what you would have liked him to do, given the climate of public opinion. It almost seems if Germany is announcing unrestricted submarine warfare, you have to send the ambassador home. And I'm wondering, because a lot of what Wilson does in these December, January, February months is very much approved of and lauded by some of the great sort of thinkers outside of the administration of the age. So I'm wondering if public opinion really would have allowed Wilson to do
actually, 2 quick points then about the state of public opinion. First, contrary to the general impression, including in the historical literature, the peak of pro-Allied opinion had already come and gone in the United States.
Yes.
The pro-Allied opinion peaks in the year after the Lusitania sinking, between May 1915 and May 1916. Pro-Allied sentiment is slowly dwindling from May 1916 on for lots of different reasons. So it's still substantial, but it's not nearly what it had been a year earlier. Mm-hmm. And the dominant sentiment in the country was to stay out of the war. I agree. And the dwindling of that sentiment is epitomized by no one better than the example you just mentioned, Walter Lippmann and Herbert Croly. Mm-hmm. The Peace Without Victory editorial that inspired the Peace Without Victory speech. This is a period in which Lippmann in particular is moving towards the absolute apogee of his influence in public affairs. Partly because there's no one Wilson doesn't rely on anyone in his government to actually help him. So he's getting his ideas, frankly, from editors in the New Republic. House has no particular intellectual heft of his own. It's amazing. But if anyone goes back and reads the Peace Without Victory piece in the New Republic, they'll see that actually the piece is anti-Allied. It's not anti-German. The whole thrust of the piece is basically to chastise the British, and David Lloyd George in particular, for aspiring to unattainable war aims and not trying and appearing to defy what the world was calling for, which is a compromise peace. Now, how then do you deal with the public outcry about the German U-boat war if you're Wilson in January 31st? And it seems to me the only way you deal with that is you've got to then do something in response that shows the Germans stepping back. Hence, that's why, and the Germans had offered him the tools to do this, that's why the peace move would be made to look as if I have threatened the Germans with war, and rather than go to war with us, they have agreed to talk peace and have agreed to lift the U-boat war in connection with that. Now, Bettman had promised him that the Germans would do that. And you see how Wilson can play this. Furious at the German U-boat war, I have told them we are prepared to go to war with you. In response, they have said, very well, then we will talk peace and abandon the U-boat war when the peace talks start, and indeed put Belgium on the table right away. I think that totally handles your public opinion problem. It shows that Wilson has used the threat of war to bring the Germans to the peace table on a compromise basis. They don't know, see, the public doesn't know that the Germans had been offering that for months. They will think that this is something Wilson would have gained by his muscular threat of war. But you know, the Americans don't see it.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask another question about long-term significance, but I think a lot of the questions in the chat kind of point to that. So okay. A few questions. Well, let me start with a historiographical question from kind of going way back. How does your work, and think about this again in terms of the long-term consequences of this story. How does your work build on your good friend and one of my former mentors, Ernest May's um, work in 1959 on the World War and American isolation? That's one question. Another question was, why do you think Wilson, after the failure, this kind of bewildering failure to him of this closing of this peace window, one of the people in the audience wants to know, why did he maintain his faith in multilateralism or in deliberative foreign policy in a community of power through the end of the war? And how did these events, do you think, influence his thinking at Versailles? Why don't we start with those two for now from the audience?
Yeah, so the historiographical question is a great question. It came from our colleague Tom Schwartz at Vanderbilt. Tom was a student of Ernie May, as in a way I am too. So the book he's referring to is one of what I think are the three seminal works on America, why America got into World War I, written after the first generation of materials became available. Ernest May, Arthur Link, and actually a Swedish historian named Carl Birnbaum, all wrote in the late 50s and early 60s on this. And the story actually is partly the story of this book. The whole origin of this book lies in a conversation between me and Ernie May that occurred a couple of years before Ernie's death. We were working on a world history project together. And we went back over the evidence about the secret German peace move, which is in the German documents. And we began talking about this and musings like, what did happen to this? And we began pulling that thread a little bit more, because we both read German and were following some of the German stuff. And then we went back to the Lansdowne memo. Now, there was a question in the chat about a famous Lansdowne letter. The Lansdowne letter that historians know about is from the fall of 1917. The Lansdowne memo was while Lansdowne was at the heart of power. It's in the fall of 1916. The Lansdowne memo is much more important than the Lansdowne letter. The Lansdowne memo is what catalyzed the debate in the British cabinet in the fall of 1916 on whether to go on with the war. And so we remembered the secret German peace move, we remembered the Lansdowne memo, and we began digging into this some more. We looked again at House's diaries, which were not as readily available to scholars in the late 50s and early 60s in their unexpurgated form as they are now. And there's some new British evidence too. And it was Ernie and I actually decided, oh my God, this really needs a completely new look. We really need to dig hard into this question of what did happen to the German peace move. We thought that this deserved a really important further examination. And then Ernie died a couple of years later in 2009. And I kept chipping away at this book for more than 10 years since then. And what you have now, in a way, is the result of that sort of brainstorming moment that Ernest and I had shortly before his death. In answer to your other questioner about how did Wilson think about diplomacy afterwards, he ended up deciding that the diplomacy failed because of Prussian militarism. And that therefore Prussian militarism had to be destroyed in the peace somehow. He had not given up on peace negotiations. He was very sure that the kind of international system that had produced the worst war in human history was clearly not a model for the future.
Solid.
So you needed some kind of different system from that. And so then you go out, but the argument I make, and the argument I make about the peace in 1919, which I make in the epilogue, is not that dissimilar from the argument you'd find from historians like Zara Steiner or Margaret Macmillan, and others who've looked hard at this, or Carol Fink. I actually am quite sympathetic to the Peacemakers, and I basically think they made the best of an impossible set of problems. The things were so bad after the further 2 years of war, with the Russian Civil War, with the complete collapse of Central and Eastern Europe into revolution and civil war, the collapse of Middle East, the Greek-Turkish War, things were so bad that I think there was no peace possible that ends up making everyone live happily ever after. The Peacemakers, I think Wilson had a modest but important influence in the peace talks, but his influence was always going to be relatively limited. The tragedy, in a way, is that the expectations from the peace by that time were so high because America had had to commit 2 million troops to the war to help win it. And all would be redeemed by the peace. And it put such expectations on the peace, expectations that could not possibly be fulfilled by the messy outcome of what actually could occur in Paris. I think under the circumstances, Wilson tried as hard as he could in Paris and did just about as well as he could have. That's separate from the issue of whether he should have compromised with the Senate on reservations or not. And I actually don't think even if America had joined the League of Nations, it would have made a fundamental difference, because Americans were so fundamentally disgusted with the outcomes that they were withdrawing from European politics and intervention anyway. So I don't fault Wilson quite as much in 1919 as maybe some people do. On the good side, when Wilson and House actually worked together in the field in Paris in 1919, Wilson finally had the chance to really see how bad House was. And their relationship then broke, and Wilson ended up never speaking to House again.
By the way, if you want a really good book, folks, on that peace conference era that has a slightly different interpretation than Phil's, I know a guy.
Cooper? Breaking the Heart of the World?
Well, yeah, there's another guy with a long Norwegian name too.
Oh, okay.
I want to get to some more audience questions. A couple actually are interesting, and these I think it's kind of similar to the question about France. We had some people asking about, where is Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans and everyone in this story? And
Bettman coordinated the peace move with his allies. The August 1916 peace move I described, as I said, this was no little informal thing. Bettman was cleared with the Kaiser. Bettman coordinated the move with the leading political factions in the German government, including in the Bundesrat of the Imperial German government. He coordinated with the Austrians. He coordinated with the Turks. So he had them all lined up for a compromise peace. The Austrians themselves totally wanted a compromise peace and had totally bought into Bettman's plans for a compromise peace. The Austrians had bought into it so completely that British intelligence found out about that too. And that was yet one more source of information that the British and Americans had, that the Central Powers were ready to compromise. And meanwhile, the Allies were moving rapidly towards losing the war in 1917. So everything was coming together for a compromise. The Allies could not have. They knew that the Central Powers wanted a compromise peace. The Allies were running out of money to continue the war, even if they wanted to. And had they tried to continue the war without American help, they would have lost the war in 1917. Because of the collapse of Russia, the French army mutinies in the spring of 1917, Italy almost collapses in the fall of 1917. The British offensive at Passchendaele is ruinous. So really, the only thing that allows the war to continue is the American entry. and the American entry was unnecessary under the circumstances.
Another question, given the significance of this moment, from David Patterson. So why have so few people written about it? Why did it not strike, Arthur Link or Birnbaum or others as there being a there?
Yes, that's a terrific question, Trig, and to David Patterson. And I've thought a lot about this question. But to be blunt, I actually think this book could have been written probably any time in the last 35 to 40 years. That is, I think all the evidence was basically available. If people it could have been written for a while. Here's the problem. The problem is no one knew the story existed except really the Germans for a long time. The whole story was quite deliberately covered up by House in his lifetime, which is the interwar period. House publishes this version of his diaries that he did with the Yale historian Seymour that deliberately edits out a lot of the key material from his diaries. And the British had no interest in publicizing this and didn't know what had happened. So there is some really quite suggestive evidence that the Germans discuss and release at the beginning of the 1920s. But unless you follow the German evidence, and everyone was distracted with the 1914 war guilt controversy during the interwar period. So the story disappears from view. It just disappears. By the late 50s and early 60s, the things that are missing here is full access and digestion of the House diaries and of the full House diaries now. And then lining that up against the German evidence does not really occur. People did not really know the issue was there, and they did not look for it. And this was when the key things like May's work in 58, Birnbaum's work also around 58, 59. Now, in the early 60s, Gerhard Ritter begins calling attention again to all the German evidence, but he's only writing in German. Link starts seeing this and it begins to dawn on Link in the stuff that he's writing in the mid-60s and on into the 70s. You can see it because Link's interpretation of this material starts getting revised. And towards the end of his writing on this, Link is now coming around to the view that it's all Lansing's fault. That at first he had started blaming the Germans, then he realized they're not to blame. And then he starts blaming Lansing for it. And that's not, and House too. Link began to hold House responsible. But see, Link in a way, Link's not a diplomat. He didn't really understand how diplomacy could work. And so he never really understood what had gone wrong in the story all that much better than Wilson himself had understood it. And Link did not work with the British evidence. And the British evidence is the last big treasure trove of evidence to come out. A lot of the key British evidence does not come out to begin with until the 70s and 80s. We're talking now not just about the records at the Public Record Office, now called the National Archives of the United Kingdom, but we're also talking about the full diaries of Maurice Hankey, who was effectively the national security advisor of the British War Cabinet, the diaries of Lloyd George's mistress, and other, also I cite a couple of records of British cabinet meetings, which weren't supposed to have notes, but which were taken by a man named Lord Harcourt, some of which is absolute dynamite in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So some of the British material also is kind of the decrypts of the British intelligence intercepts. And so you need to then pull all this together. I think it was possible to do this starting in the 1980s. I actually even think that some of the people working on the Woodrow Wilson papers in the early 1980s were beginning to see this. I can just tell from some of the footnotes, I think some of the people who were editing those papers, the light bulbs were going off. And it was almost like they were urging historians to take another look at this. And I guess I'm one of the ones who did.
A few more questions. We have 10 minutes remaining. Let me see. We have a couple of questions about maybe larger or, again, maybe factors beyond Wilson's control that might have shaped this. One about...
Oh, I'm sorry, just one more thing. Forgive
yeah.
me for interrupting. I just saw something in David Patterson's note. The German archives on this stuff are very strong and have been strong, are excellent, but it does help to be able to read German, right? Which actually, really very few of the American scholars ever really tried to get, but then they didn't know to look at it because they didn't know it was an issue. I'm sorry to have interrupted.
No, not at all, not at all. So one is a question, where is the guns of August and all this, which I take to mean, how does the whole system of rivalries and everything that helps us explain, to the degree that we can, the outbreak of the war, is there maybe kind of an inertia still going on that narrows this window even as it's opened? And then another factor that you address very, very directly, but maybe could be expanded upon. You've got a question about what was Edward House's goal? His why was he dissembling? Why was he not open with Wilson? And then I hope you'll save time just to give your kind of 2 or 3 minute, summative argument about why this is important to us today, or to policymakers, or to the State Department, or to people who want to be diplomats, or to our public life generally.
Yeah, in a way, let me kind of wrap your first and last comments together and kind of, because the first comment was really about how do you overcome the sheer inertia of the war making to end the war? And in a way, that's the lesson I want people to take away from the book for today. Is if I tell you the moral of the story is you need to understand diplomacy, people will all nod their heads and go to sleep. It's like diplomacy is one of those words that you say it and people, yeah, diplomacy, their eyes glaze over. Think about instead, here's this colossal problem you're trying to solve. How do we end the war? Good news, most of the war leaders after the summer of 1916 realize that they need to bring the war to an end. They want to bring the war to an end. One of their great foes, and Bettman had a magnificent expression for this, Trig. Bettman referred to how do we overcome what he called the machine of war passion. And by the way, and he worked out the answer to this, which he then deployed when in his political consultations, because he got the German government ready for a compromise peace. So his answer to how you overcome it is everybody has to have a story of how they won. Mm-hmm. Everyone has to be able to say they won. Well, how do you say that? How can they all say that? Because all of them believe they are fighting the war in self-defense. Yeah, are there bureaucrats and generals who were hungering for annexations and drawing up papers? Yes. But what Bettman and the other political leaders realized, this is a people's war by this time. And the people all think they are fighting in self-defense. The Germans had this narrative. I mean, if you get into the world of the Germans or the Austrians, they think that their enemies encircled them and ambushed them with the assassination of the Archduke. They feel they were invaded. See, the Americans and the British, Westerners tend to know about the invasion of Belgium. The Germans and Austrians have a national memory of the Russian invasion of 1914. Russia invaded Germany, it invaded Austrian Galicia, and did a lot of damage. The invaders were thrown out in 1915. That's what made Hindenburg a hero. But they think they're fighting the war in self-defense. The reason their political parties are uniting behind the war for the first couple of years is because even the socialists agree on fighting a war of self-defense, especially against the Russians. So Bettman is structuring a narrative. Look, this is a successful peace if our enemies have all combined against us and we fight them off and survive. We keep Germany intact. There's even an analogy in German history to this that everyone refers to in Germany called the Hubertusburg Peace, looking back to a precedent in the 7 Years' War that Bernstorff mentions, Bettman mentions. All right. That same narrative is available for Britain. Britain entered the war in self-defense, above all to redeem the violation of Belgium's neutrality. And Belgium had been invaded so the Germans could get at France. So Britain could say, we entered the war to stop Prussian militarism and insert Britain's shield against the German spear. And we have turned that spear aside. Germany has withdrawn from Belgium, has renounced its conquests in Belgium and France. We have shown that militarism failed. Edward Grey, writing after the war, said that was an argument that would have worked. That was an argument that would have worked with the British people. And if the Germans had restored Belgium, internally, the British recognized Belgium was the issue that held together the British war effort. France had been invaded. So what France needed above all is that the German invader leaves France, that France had defended herself. Now, France wanted more, and ideally France wanted more. France wanted to get back the Alsace-Lorraine territory that it had lost in 1871, but that would have required a German defeat. But you know what? Bettman and Briand were secretly trying to cut a deal on Alsace and Lorraine in the winter of 1617. So even on that, the point is they could have all had their narrative of we fought for self-defense and we succeeded. They all would have been scarred and bitter. There still would have been lots of lingering resentments and others about the enemies that had not been beaten enough. And so the peace would have been opposed by minority factions in all these governments because there were minority factions that wanted absolute victory. But what you see in the book and what those who study this, the majority of the soldiers and the majority of the people actually wanted to win the war of self-defense alone and wanted desperately to bring the war to an end. And that was the outcome that was available to them in the last months of 1916. And the Americans were perfectly positioned to do it. All the sides he had complete power over the Allies, and the Germans had put on the table everything that he would need to develop a compromise peace.
I think that is a very appropriate place to leave it. I'm sorry we didn't get to House, but you do talk about it a little bit in the book, of course. I want to thank you very, very much for an excellent book. Again, it's The Road Less Traveled from Public Affairs. It's out it was just out in March, which I guess we're still in. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I encourage you to check out the rest of the history and public policy programming at the Wilson Center. If you go to wilsoncenter.org /programs/history, just type that into Google and you'll get there. Please join us next month, April 27th, when we speak with Charles Cook-Chan about his new book on isolationism in American history, which has several chapters and lots of discussion on Woodrow Wilson. And again, thank you everybody for joining us. And most of all, thank you, Philip Zelikow, for a great book and a wonderful and enlightening discussion.
And thank you, Trig. And there's no better guide to the ideas of this period than Trygve Throntveit book.
Thank you very much. Thanks all for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.